Love and Crime. Lessons on Trust and Forgiveness. The encounter. Rachel never thought her life would change so drastically in just one evening. She had been living in the quiet suburbs of Westbridge, a town where nothing much happened. It was a place where people left their doors unlocked, and neighbors still borrowed sugar from each other. Her routine was predictable. Work as a marketing executive, return to her modest apartment, cook a simple dinner, and unwind with a book or a show. But everything shifted the night she met Daniel. It was a rainy evening, one of those early autumn nights where the air smelled of wet leaves and the chill hinted at the coming winter. Rachel was late leaving the office, her boss demanding one last report before she could leave. By the time she walked out, the rain had started to pour heavily, and she cursed herself for forgetting her umbrella. As she dashed toward her car, her heel caught a slick patch, and before she knew it, she was sprawled on the pavement, her papers scattered, and her ankle throbbing in pain. Cursing under her breath, she tried to collect her things, but her ankle was twisted, making every move agonizing. That's when she noticed him. A tall figure with broad shoulders, his dark hair soaked from the rain, approached her from the shadows. His deep-set eyes were the first thing she noticed, piercing and intense, like he could see right through her. "Need some help?" His voice was smooth, yet there was something almost too calm about it, considering the storm raging around them. Rachel hesitated. It wasn't often that she found herself in such situations, and though the man looked harmless enough, the warning bells in the back of her mind rang loud and clear. She was alone in an empty parking lot, the rain obscuring her surroundings, and this stranger was offering assistance. It felt too convenient. But her ankle was throbbing, and she had little choice. "Yeah, thanks. I think I twisted my ankle," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He moved closer and knelt beside her, helping her gather her scattered belongings. "I'm Daniel, by the way." "Rachel," she replied, watching him carefully. He seemed polite, maybe even a little charming. But something was off. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, yet there was an unshakable feeling that lingered in her gut. He helped her to her feet, and despite the cold rain, she felt a warmth in his touch. His grip was firm, yet gentle, as if he knew how to handle her without making her feel vulnerable. The ache in her ankle flared, and she winced. "Do you need a ride home?" he asked, glancing at her car. "That doesn't look too safe to drive with a bad ankle." She hesitated again, but his suggestion made sense. Her ankle wasn't getting any better, and driving home like this could lead to an accident. The rain kept pouring, and the isolation of the parking lot felt suffocating. She glanced around, hoping to spot another person or car, but there was nothing but darkness and rain. "All right," she finally said, trying to keep her voice casual. "I guess I could use a lift." "Thanks." He smiled, a charming, almost too perfect smile, and led her to his car parked nearby. It was a sleek black sedan, spotless despite the weather. As he opened the passenger door for her, Rachel's eyes briefly caught something in the back seat, a flash of metal, something shiny. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it a weapon? She pushed the thought aside, telling herself it was probably nothing. Maybe a tool, or something harmless. Still, her heart raced faster, and as she settled into the passenger seat, the seatbelt clicked with a heavy finality. Daniel got into the driver's seat and started the engine, the low hum of the car blending with the sound of the rain beating against the windows. He glanced at her, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite read. "You okay?" he asked, his voice smooth and calm. "Yeah, just cold," Rachel replied, trying to focus on anything but the object in the back seat. The car pulled out of the parking lot, and as they drove through the rain-soaked streets, Rachel found herself growing more and more uneasy. She tried to make small talk, to keep the tension at bay, but every question she asked was met with vague answers. Daniel, it seemed, was keeping his cards close to his chest. "So, do you live around here?" she asked. "Not too far," he replied, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "Just passing through, actually." "Passing through? On a night like this?" Rachel tried to keep her tone light, but her fingers tightened around her phone. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. "Yeah, just visiting some family," Daniel said, his voice smooth but distant. He glanced at her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Nothing too exciting. Rachel nodded, though the knot in her stomach tightened. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was she overthinking things? Was this just paranoia from too many late-night crime shows? Or was there something darker at play? As they turned onto a quiet, narrow road, the streetlights growing sparse, Rachel's phone buzzed with a text. She glanced at the screen. A message from her friend, Sarah. You okay? Haven't heard from you. Call me when you get home. She stared at the screen for a moment too long. Everything all right? Daniel asked, his voice soft but laced with something that made her blood run cold. Rachel forced a smile. Yeah, just my friend checking in. He nodded, but his grip on the steering wheel seemed to tighten ever so slightly. The silence between them grew heavy, the air thick with an unspoken tension. Then, without warning, Daniel spoke, his voice low and deliberate. You know, it's funny. You never really know who you can trust, do you? The warning. Rachel's heart skipped a beat at Daniel's words. His voice was casual, but the weight of his statement pressed down on her like an invisible force. She forced herself to swallow the growing anxiety, her mind racing for an appropriate response. Yeah, I guess, she said softly, trying to sound nonchalant. Trust can be tricky. Daniel's lips curled into that same unsettling smile, but this time there was a hint of something darker in his eyes, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The car continued to glide through the wet streets, the windshield wipers rhythmically slicing through the rain. The streetlights grew even sparser, and Rachel realized they were heading toward the outskirts of town. She knew this area well enough. Beyond the main road, there were long stretches of woodland, an old industrial park that had been abandoned for years and little else. Her mind screamed at her to get out, to do something, but her body remained frozen in place. The fear of making a wrong move kept her paralyzed. She needed to think clearly. Where exactly are we going? She asked, her voice tighter than she intended. She tried to mask her fear, but she knew Daniel could hear it. We're almost there, he replied, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. Just a little further. Rachel's pulse quickened. Almost where? She hadn't given him her address yet, had she? Panic clawed at her chest as she realized she'd been so distracted by his presence that she hadn't even noticed which direction they were going. Her phone was still at her lap, the screen dark. She could feel its weight, like a lifeline tethered to the real world. She needed to text someone, anyone, but how? Daniel's gaze flickered toward her every few moments, as if he was watching her every move, assessing her next decision. Rachel glanced out the window. The trees on either side of the road blurred into dark shapes, and the road ahead seemed to stretch into endless darkness. There wasn't a house or a car in sight, just emptiness. Can you pull over? She asked suddenly, forcing a laugh. I'm starting to feel a little nauseous, probably from the rain and all this motion. Daniel didn't respond immediately, and the silence hung in the air, suffocating her. For a second, she thought he might refuse. But then he slowly nodded, his expression unreadable.
Sure, he said.
I'll find a spot up ahead. They drove another minute in silence, the tension between them palpable. Rachel's mind raced through her options. Should she make a run for it the moment the car stopped? Or should she try to keep up the act, pretending she was fine until she could find a way to signal for help? Her phone buzzed again, a second message from Sarah. She glanced down quickly. Seriously, are you okay? Call me. Don't make me worry. She turned the phone over, hiding the screen from Daniel's view. Her heart pounded. She couldn't afford to show any sign of panic. Finally, the car began to slow. Daniel pulled over to the side of the road near a patch of dense trees, and the engine idled softly. He turned to look at her, his eyes lingering on her face. You sure you're all right? He asked, his voice soft but laced with that same unsettling undertone. Rachel nodded, her throat dry. Yeah, just need some air. He watched her for a moment longer, as if trying to gauge whether she was telling the truth. Then, slowly, he reached over and unlocked her door with a soft click. The sound sent a shiver down her spine. It felt deliberate, like he was giving her a choice, and yet trapping her at the same time. Take your time, Daniel said, leaning back in his seat. No rush. Rachel's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. She could feel Daniel's eyes on her, and every fiber of her being screamed at her to run. But she couldn't just bolt out of the car. It would be too obvious. Too reckless. As the door swung open, the cool night air hit her, carrying the scent of wet earth and leaves. She stepped out cautiously, wincing as her twisted ankle flared with pain. The rain had eased up, now just a light drizzle, but the darkness around them felt thicker, more oppressive. She glanced around, searching for any sign of life. Nothing.
She needed a plan.
Leaning against the car for support, she took a few deep breaths, pretending to steady herself. Her phone was still in her pocket. If she could just send a message to Sarah or dial 911 without Daniel noticing, she might have a chance. Rachel took a cautious step forward, her mind racing. Should she ask for help now?
Run? Call someone?
Every second felt like a decision she couldn't afford to get wrong. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A small flicker in the trees, something barely visible in the darkness. Her pulse quickened. Was it her imagination? Or was something watching them from the woods? Rachel? Daniel's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it now. He had gotten out of the car too, his tall frame standing beside her. Are you sure you're all right? She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. He was closer now, too close. She could feel the weight of his presence, like a predator watching its prey. Before she could answer, a distant sound pierced the silence, a rustling from the woods. Rachel's eyes widened as she turned toward the noise, her breath catching in her throat. The flicker of movement was real. Something or someone was out there. Daniel followed her gaze, his expression darkening. For the first time since they'd met, his calm demeanor cracked, and something dangerous flashed across his face. You weren't supposed to know, he muttered under his breath, his voice low and almost menacing. Rachel's blood ran cold. Know what? Before she could process his words, Daniel's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist in a tight grip. The pressure was immediate, bruising, and all pretense of charm vanished from his face. The calm stranger was gone, replaced by something far more menacing. Escape. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as Daniel's grip tightened around her wrist. His face, once so composed, had transformed into a mask of cold determination. The rain, now a mere drizzle, seemed to amplify the deafening silence between them. Her mind screamed for her to act. Run.
Fight.
Do something. But fear held her paralyzed, her thoughts a whirl of panic. She stared into Daniel's eyes, searching for some trace of the polite man who had helped her just minutes ago. But all she saw now was control, an unyielding dominance that sent shivers down her spine. You weren't supposed to know, Daniel repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The calm, calculated tone was gone, replaced by something far more sinister. Rachel's pulse pounded in her ears, and she tried to yank her arm free, but his grip only tightened, his fingers digging into her skin. She winced in pain, but a surge of adrenaline kicked in, fueled by the desperate need to escape. She began, but Daniel cut her off, his voice sharp and cold. It doesn't matter now, he said, his eyes narrowing. You've seen too much. Rachel's heart raced. Seen too much. What was he talking about? The flicker of movement in the woods? The shiny object in the back seat? Her instincts screamed at her to run, but the pain in her ankle was a cruel reminder of how limited her options were. She couldn't outrun him like this.
She needed to think fast.
I didn't see anything, she lied, trying to sound convincing, her voice trembling. I swear, please let me go. I won't say anything. I don't even know what's happening. Daniel studied her, his eyes cold and calculating. For a brief moment, she thought he might believe her. But then his lips curled into a twisted smile, one that sent a wave of dread crashing over her. That's the problem, Rachel, he said softly, leaning in closer, his breath warm against her skin. You don't need to know what's happening. You just need to disappear. Her blood ran cold. Disappear. The word echoed in her mind, a chilling confirmation of her worst fears. Whatever was happening, Daniel had no intention of letting her walk away from it. Without thinking, Rachel acted. She drove her free hand into Daniel's side, her fingers clawing at him, trying to find some way to break his hold. He flinched, caught off guard by the sudden attack, but his grip didn't loosen. "Let go," she shouted, her voice louder than she intended. But Daniel was faster. In a swift, calculated move, he yanked her toward him, pulling her off balance. Rachel stumbled, her ankle screaming in pain as she tried to regain her footing. Panic surged through her veins, but she fought to stay focused. She had to get away, had to survive. As she struggled, something sharp grazed her fingertips, her phone, still in her pocket. Desperation fueled her as she managed to pull it out, her fingers trembling. She couldn't outrun him, but maybe she could signal for help. With a burst of energy, she jerked her arm free, surprising Daniel for just a split second. It was all the time she needed. She turned and bolted toward the woods, her limp making every step agonizing, but the fear driving her was stronger than the pain. Her phone slipped from her grasp as she ran, but there was no time to stop. Behind her, she heard Daniel curse under his breath, his footsteps close and fast, the sound of his pursuit growing louder with every second. The woods ahead offered no safety, just a shadowy labyrinth of trees and undergrowth, but it was her only chance. Rachel crashed through the underbrush, her breath ragged, her twisted ankle threatening to give out with each step. The forest floor was slick with mud, and the branches tore at her clothes as she pushed forward, the dark shadows swallowing her whole. She could hear Daniel behind her, gaining on her, his footsteps relentless. "Rachel." His voice cut through the trees, sharp and angry now. "Stop. You're only making this harder." Her heart pounded in her chest, her lungs burning from the cold, damp air. She couldn't stop. She couldn't let him catch her. Every instinct in her body screamed for survival, and she clung to that primal need with everything she had. As she ran, the flicker of movement she had seen earlier flashed in her mind. Was there someone else out here? Could they help? She strained to hear any other sounds, voices, footsteps, but all she could hear was her own frantic breathing and the crashing of branches behind her. Her ankle gave out beneath her, sending her tumbling to the ground, her hands scraping against the wet earth. Pain shot through her leg, and she bit back a cry. She had to get up. She had to keep moving. But as she tried to push herself up, a shadow loomed over her. Daniel. He was faster than she had expected. His face was twisted with frustration, his once calm demeanor shattered by the chase. He grabbed her arm again, pulling her roughly to her feet. "You should have just stayed in the car," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. Rachel's vision blurred with tears, the weight of hopelessness crashing over her. She had no strength left to fight, no way to outrun him. He had won. Just as Daniel tightened his grip on her, something strange happened. A new sound emerged from the darkness of the trees, a low, growling noise. Rachel's heart leaped in her chest. An animal? But no, it wasn't an animal. It was a person. "Let her go," a voice commanded from the shadows. Daniel froze, his grip on Rachel loosening slightly. His head snapped toward the direction of the voice, his eyes narrowing. From the darkness, a figure stepped forward, shrouded in the mist and shadows of the woods. A man, tall and lean, his face hidden beneath a hood. Rachel's heart raced, a mixture of hope and terror flooding her. Was this person here to help, or to harm her even more? Daniel straightened, his body tense. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking slightly, betraying his fear. The figure didn't answer immediately. He took another step closer, his presence commanding, dangerous. "I said," the voice repeated, cold and steady, "let her go." In that moment, Rachel saw something flicker in Daniel's eyes, a crack in his confidence. He hesitated, his grip faltering. The tension hung thick in the air, and for a brief, terrifying moment, no one moved. Then, with a snarl of frustration, Daniel shoved Rachel to the ground and turned toward the hooded figure, his fists clenched, ready for a fight. But the stranger didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his posture calm but poised, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Rachel scrambled backward, her heart pounding. She had no idea who this man was, but he had just saved her life, at least for the moment. The stranger. Rachel's body trembled as she scrambled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. Her entire body ached, her ankle throbbed, her hands were raw from the fall, and her mind spun with the surreal nature of it all. But the most terrifying thing was Daniel, now standing only a few feet away, facing off against the mysterious stranger who had emerged from the shadows. Daniel's stance was tense, fists clenched tightly, his eyes flicking between Rachel and the hooded figure. His calm demeanor had completely disintegrated, replaced by a thinly veiled rage that bubbled just beneath the surface. But Rachel saw something else in his expression: uncertainty. He didn't know who this new arrival was, and that had rattled him. The hooded figure stepped closer, his movements deliberate and controlled. He was tall, almost as tall as Daniel, and his voice carried an authority that seemed to slice through the tension like a blade. "You should leave now," the stranger said, his tone even and unthreatening, but with an unmistakable undertone of menace. "Before you do something you regret." Daniel let out a short, bitter laugh. "You don't know what you're getting into, buddy. Walk away, and I'll forget I ever saw you." The stranger remained silent, the hood shadowing most of his face, but the set of his shoulders was unmistakably unyielding. He wasn't going anywhere. For a moment, Daniel seemed to consider his options. He glanced over at Rachel, still crumpled on the ground, before returning his gaze to the stranger. The rain had nearly stopped now, and the sound of dripping leaves filled the air, mingling with the tension. Then, without warning, Daniel lunged at the hooded man, his fists flying. Rachel gasped, her body frozen in terror. The attack was fast, but the stranger was faster. He sidestepped Daniel's punch with fluid ease, his movements calculated and precise. In one swift motion, the stranger grabbed Daniel's arm, twisted it behind his back, and slammed him against a nearby tree. Daniel let out a pained grunt, but before he could retaliate, the stranger's arm pressed against the back of his neck, pinning him in place. The whole exchange had happened in a matter of seconds, but it was enough to make Rachel's head spin. This stranger had subdued Daniel with an almost frightening efficiency. "You don't want to test me," the stranger said, his voice calm and measured, as if the entire situation was under his control. "Walk away." For a moment, it looked like Daniel might resist, but the pressure on his neck increased, and he let out a strained breath. After a few seconds of tense silence, Daniel finally relented. All right, he growled through clenched teeth. "I'll go. But this isn't over." The stranger released him, and Daniel immediately staggered forward, rubbing his neck with a glare that could have set fire to the trees. He shot a final, venomous look at Rachel before turning on his heel and storming off into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Rachel sat there, stunned, her breath shallow as she tried to process what had just happened. The immediate threat was gone, but her heart still raced, and her body shook with residual fear. Who was this stranger? Why had he helped her? The hooded man turned toward her, his posture relaxing slightly now that Daniel was gone. He took a step forward, but Rachel flinched, instinctively scooting back. The man immediately stopped, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "Easy," he said softly, his voice gentle now. "I'm not going to hurt you." Rachel's chest heaved as she fought to calm her breathing. Every part of her screamed not to trust anyone, but this man had just saved her from a nightmare. Still, the memory of Daniel's sudden transformation lingered in her mind, making it hard to trust anyone right now. Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The stranger hesitated, lowering his hands slowly. "Just someone passing through. Saw something that didn't seem right, and decided to step in."
"Why?"
Rachel's voice shook, but she couldn't help but ask. Why would a stranger risk himself for her? There had to be more to it. The man sighed, pulling his hood back. In the faint light from the scattered street lamps and the moon breaking through the clouds, Rachel could finally see his face. He was in his early 30s, with dark hair cropped close to his head and sharp, serious features. His eyes, though hard, held a flicker of something else. Concern. Maybe even guilt. "Because I know what it's like to be in a situation like that," he said, his voice quiet. "I wasn't going to let him hurt you." Rachel swallowed hard, her throat tight. The weight of what had just happened began to crash down on her. She was supposed to be on her way home after a long day at work, and now she had just narrowly escaped something far worse. Her ankle throbbed, reminding her of the pain she had almost forgotten in the chaos. "Do you need help?" the man asked, his eyes scanning her injured leg. "You're hurt." Rachel hesitated, her mind still spinning. Could she trust him? The way he had subdued Daniel so quickly was unsettling, but he hadn't shown any signs of hostility toward her. Still, she wasn't ready to fully let her guard down. Not after what just happened.
I
don't know," she admitted, her voice shaky. "I just want to get home." The stranger nodded, his expression softening. "I get it. Here, let me help you up, and we can figure out the rest." Rachel watched him carefully as he offered her a hand. Every instinct told her to refuse, but she was exhausted, her ankle was in bad shape, and she didn't have many other options. Reluctantly, she reached out and took his hand. His grip was firm but gentle, and he helped her to her feet without any sudden movements. Rachel winced as she put weight on her injured ankle, but the pain was manageable for now. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice still uncertain. "Lucas," he replied simply. "And you?" "Rachel," she said, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for what you did." Lucas nodded, his eyes scanning the woods behind them. "We need to get out of here. That guy, Daniel, he's not going to give up easily. I don't know what he's involved in, but it's dangerous. You need to be somewhere safe." Rachel's pulse quickened. The fear that had begun to fade crept back in. "What do you mean?"
Who is he?
Lucas met her gaze, his eyes darkening. "I don't know everything, but I've heard enough. He's been involved in some bad things. People like him don't let loose ends walk away." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. Loose ends. Was that what she was to Daniel now? "We need to go," Lucas repeated, glancing around. "I'll help you, but you need to trust me." Rachel hesitated, her mind racing. Could she trust him? After what she had just been through, trusting anyone felt impossible. But as she looked into Lucas's eyes, something told her she didn't have much of a choice.
A risky alliance.
Rachel stood there, torn between her instincts and the desperation for safety. Lucas's intense gaze stayed fixed on her, unwavering but not threatening. The chill of the damp forest seeped into her bones, and the reality of her situation hit her harder with every second that passed. She had narrowly escaped Daniel, but the terror lingered, gnawing at her resolve. Trusting Lucas felt like another risk, but she couldn't deny that he had saved her when no one else had. She nodded, though her body felt stiff. "Okay," she whispered. "But where are we going?" Lucas surveyed the darkened woods, his expression hardening. "First, we need to get out of here. I've got a car nearby. I'll take you somewhere safe for the night, and we'll figure out the rest in the morning." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. The idea of getting into another car with someone she barely knew filled her with dread. But she had no better option, and Lucas had shown her more concern in the last few minutes than Daniel ever had. She limped forward, her ankles still throbbing, and Lucas moved to her side, offering his arm for support. She hesitated but finally took it, letting him guide her as they moved away from the spot where the nightmare had begun. The forest around them felt unnaturally quiet, the distant sound of Daniel crashing through the woods now gone. Rachel's mind was racing with 1,000 questions, but none of them seemed to form fully. All she could focus on was putting one foot in front of the other and not thinking about what might happen next. Lucas led her through the undergrowth for what felt like an eternity before they reached a small clearing. Parked just beyond the trees was a dark sedan, half hidden by the shadows. Lucas opened the passenger door and helped Rachel inside, his movements careful and measured. "Wait here," he said, closing the door softly. He walked around to the driver's side, and Rachel's heart raced again. She hadn't realized how much she was trembling until she was alone in the silence of the car, the damp chill from the woods still clinging to her clothes. Lucas climbed into the driver's seat, turning the key in the ignition. The engine purred to life, and Rachel's body tensed instinctively. She couldn't help but think of Daniel's car, how she had felt safe at first, only to realize the darkness lurking beneath his charming facade. She forced the thought away, reminding herself that Lucas had been her savior tonight. But could she trust him beyond that moment? As they pulled away from the clearing, Lucas kept his eyes on the road, his expression unreadable. The glow from the dashboard lit his face in soft hues, and for the first time, Rachel studied him closely. He was calm, composed, but there was something haunted in his eyes. Something that told her this wasn't the first time he had found himself in a situation like this. "Where are we going?" Rachel asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've got a place just outside of town," Lucas replied, his voice steady. "It's quiet, off the grid. You'll be safe there." Rachel nodded slowly, her eyes flicking to the window, watching the dark shapes of the trees blur past. Her mind drifted to Daniel, his last words ringing in her ears. This isn't over. What had she stumbled into? Why had Daniel turned so suddenly? And who was Lucas, really? "You didn't just happen to be passing through, did you?" she asked after a long silence, her voice tinged with suspicion. Lucas's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too firmly. "No," he admitted. "I've been keeping an eye on Daniel for a while now." Rachel's heart skipped a beat.
Why? Who is he?
"He's not who he pretends to be," Lucas said grimly, his eyes still fixed on the road. "He's part of something bigger, something dangerous. I can't give you all the details yet, but let's just say you weren't the first person he's tried to hurt." Rachel swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. She had sensed something was off about Daniel from the moment his charm started to slip, but now she realized how close she had come to real danger, danger far beyond what she could have imagined. "So what now?" she asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "If he's involved in something dangerous, then what do we do?" Lucas glanced at her briefly, his eyes softening for a moment. "We lay low. Daniel will come looking for you. He won't want to leave any loose ends." Rachel's chest tightened. "Why me?" "I don't even know what's going on." "Because you know too much now," Lucas said. "You're a witness, and people like Daniel can't afford witnesses." The reality of her situation hit her like a punch to the gut. She was trapped in something she didn't understand, with no way out except through Lucas. He had helped her tonight, but what if he had his own agenda? What if there was more to him than he was letting on? "Why are you helping me?" Rachel asked, her voice almost a whisper. Lucas didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained focused on the road, but there was a flicker of something in them, something almost vulnerable. "Because I know what it's like to be where you are," he finally said. "I've been there, and I couldn't just stand by and let it happen to someone else." Rachel's heart softened slightly at his words, but the fear remained. She still didn't know if she could fully trust him, but right now, she had no other choice. The car fell into an uneasy silence as they continued to drive through the dark, winding roads. The farther they went, the more isolated the landscape became, with only the occasional flicker of a distant house or passing car to remind them they weren't completely alone. Finally, after what felt like hours, Lucas turned onto a narrow dirt road, the tires crunching softly beneath them. At the end of the road stood a small cabin, tucked away in the woods, almost invisible in the darkness. "This is it," Lucas said quietly, pulling up to the front of the cabin. He shut off the engine and turned to face her. "You'll be safe here for tonight. We'll figure out the next steps tomorrow." Rachel looked at the cabin, her anxiety rising again. It looked secluded, almost too perfect for hiding. But with Daniel still out there, she had no better options. She nodded, her voice barely audible. "Okay." Lucas helped her out of the car, his movements gentle but firm, and together they walked toward the cabin. As they approached the door, Lucas paused for a moment, glancing around the woods as if listening for something unseen. "Stay close," he whispered. Rachel's heart pounded as they entered the cabin. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing her in with the one person who might be her only chance at survival or her next threat.